All right. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Last week we got as far as verse 12 and 13. We've noted there's appointed for the experience of man, there's a time for everything. And in our experience, we will either personally encounter those occasions, or we will be aware of others who encounter those situations. There's not a single thing that is listed in that grouping of verses 1 through verse 8 that is outside of even our modern experience, that continues to be a very real experience in the life of man. And in verse 11, notice the contrast between, and really what's been in the thought of Solomon from chapter 2 to chapter 3 is this contrast between the mental, or the mortal concept, the mortal mind, the physical way of thinking, versus that same experience, the same life, but viewing it from a spiritual perspective. That's kind of been the balance that Solomon is pointing out, that when you have just a mortal, physical perspective on things, that all of this is vanity, it's all grasping for the wind. But with a spiritual perspective, that it puts it in its proper place, and you have the proper priorities, so you're able to be content with the fact that we are going to one day die. We live a mortal existence. There are joys, there are sorrows, and that's simply the way life works. And so you see that contrast in verse 11, that he's put eternity in their hearts. Man looks for something else after this life. He always has. And of course that started with Adam and Eve. And that viewing, that looking forward to something after this, man has always had that in his heart. But that's why so often it's hard for man, especially when he has left what God has taught him, it's hard for man to reconcile the desire for this life to mean something, and yet at the same time acknowledge one day he's going to die. And that's very difficult for man to reconcile. It's very hard for him to come to terms with that outside of God's direction. So in verse 12, Solomon concludes that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor as the gift of God. As long as the proper priorities are in the mind of individuals who are serving God, God gives us richly all things to enjoy. And so this is, make the most of the time that you have. Again, within the boundaries of God's will, but make the most of it. Enjoy what God has blessed you with. Verse 14. Solomon says, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. God does it, that men should fear before him. A lot of times our minds are automatically drawn, especially that middle part, nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. Our minds are drawn immediately to the law of God, whether it was the patriarchal law, the law of Moses, or now under the law of Christ. Specifically because there's so many references to that concept, nothing added, nothing taken away, with regard to the law. That God has said what he wants. You can't add something to it and assume that's okay, and you can't take anything away from it and assume that that's okay. Nadab and Abihu learned that the hard way. That is true under the law of Christ, just as it was under the law of Moses. But that's not what's on Solomon's mind here. Keep in mind that the broader view of this is man's life, but even outside of that, we talked a little bit about this, not this past Sunday, but Sunday before this, is the broader picture of God's providence. God makes all things beautiful in its time, verse 11, and in God's time as well, because doesn't happen on our schedule. That being the case, you combine that with Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, we know all things work together for good to those who love God. God makes his providence to work to bring about his will. That doesn't infringe upon the free will of people, whether they're doing what God wants or not. God utilizes the decisions of man, both righteous or not, to bring about what is good according to his will. That is what is under the mindset of Solomon. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Which is to say that God's will cannot be interrupted. Man can't throw a stumbling block in the path of God. The idea, such as Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church contend, that it was always the intention of God to usher in the physical kingdom and the New Jerusalem when Jesus came. But then, oh no, the Jews and the Romans threw a kind of a slider, curveball here. And it messed everything up. And so the church is only here kind of as a stopgap measure until God sends Jesus back the second time to reestablish a new kingdom on earth. That's what the Mormons believe. That's what Joseph Smith teaches. And that is not what the Bible teaches. No man can get in the way of God's plans, God's intentions. What God decides to do, it'll be done. It shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it. Yes, His law, His word, certainly would be a part of this. But Solomon has a much more broad, much more expansive idea from here, is that God's will, that includes His providence, that includes His word, nothing can be taken away or added to it from the position of authority. God is the ultimate authority. His will is the authority. His will be done. And there's not a single thing that any man can do to force God or to twist His arm to make Him do something else, to mess Him up. It's not going to happen. God does it that men should fear before Him. When it pertains there at the end of verse 14, specifically that God does it that men should fear before Him. What specific thing does Solomon have under his consideration here? I mean, God's providence is generally only seen by those who have a mind of faith. Okay, people of the world, people who don't really care much about God or aren't really interpreting events in their life from a godly perspective or a perspective of faith, they're not going to just randomly see the providence of God usually. But what Solomon brings out is something that all of man can observe, and that it should teach him something. So what is it specifically that God has done that nothing can be added to it, nothing can be taken away from it, in God's design that should teach men to fear before God? And it's what's under the whole consideration in chapter 2, chapter 3. What is the design of God for man? Fear God, to keep His commandments, that he should enjoy the fruits of his labor. Why? What's going to happen to us one day? We're all going to die. That is what Solomon is pointing to here in verse 14. God does it that men should fear before Him. There's one thing that is in the design of God for man that should remind each person that there is a higher power, there is going to be an account, he's going to get to that in a minute, there's going to be an answer for the things that we've done, and that is the fact that we die. We are not immortal. We cannot of our own avoid death. We have no power to avoid really anything beyond ourselves. Things are going to happen that we have no control over. And God's providence is involved all through there, certainly. But what Solomon specifically points out here at the end is that man has no power to avoid that one thing that all men should learn from to fear God, that he's going to die. You can't add anything to that plan. You can't take anything away from that plan. And again, that includes all of his providence, for that matter. But this is one lasting characteristic of man's nature that speaks to the need to fear God, is that man is mortal. Anything through verse 14, and this is all going to be really a part of this, verse 15, verse 16. He's going to bring up some elements that are going to come back to this point. But anything so far through verse 14? Verse 15. That which has already been, what is to be has already been, and God requires an account of what is past. There are 3 tenses of time that are mentioned here in verse 15. What are they? Past, present, future. Is Solomon saying that the idea of civilizations, it's going to be the same type of civilization and it's going to have the same technology? Is that what he's referring to? That we're just going to constantly kind of go back to the dark ages and then come back up again? Is that what he's talking about? When he says that which is, here's our present tense, that which is right now, with regard to the nature of man. Never mind technology, never mind societies and nations and countries, the nature of man. Right now, has it changed at all in the thousands of years since Adam and Eve? No. Man is still exactly the same today as he was thousands of years ago. Do we live longer? Well, they actually lived a whole lot longer before the flood, didn't they? But do we live longer than generations preceding us, generally speaking? Yeah. We have more control over diseases. We have better medical care. We have better knowledge about how to tend to wounds. That's great. But are we really all that different from the people that have come before us? What are we still subject to? We're still mortal. We're still subject to death. And so what Solomon observes is that which is, and even beyond the mortality of man really, is people. That's one thing that I've heard preachers say over and over again, is that no matter how many generations come and go, people are always people. The technology may change, the way in which temptations are presented by Satan may change, but people are always people. And so when Solomon says that which is, it's already been. Nothing is happening right now with regard to the nature of man that wasn't happening thousands of years before. And then he says, what is to be has already been. Notice the consistent. That which has already been is mentioned twice. That which is mentioned once. That which is to be is mentioned once. But that which has been, that is what Solomon keeps going back to. And it really kind of revolves around that statement, nothing new under the sun. But especially in context of his consideration of the mortality of man, of man's nature. That doesn't change. And that speaks to the fact that nothing can be added from the design of God, especially, as is part of our context here, the way he has designed man, with eternity in his heart, despite the mortality of his flesh. That's really kind of the comparison that Solomon makes here. And in the last part of verse 15, God requires an account of what is past. And I think that's interesting because what is Solomon speaking to verse 15? Or that in part of verse 15. What is he speaking to there? He requires an account.
There will be a judgment.
Okay, there's going to be a reckoning of what?
Our actions, our lives.
Okay, of how we have conducted ourselves given the nature that we have, the mortality that we have in this life. How we live, there's going to be a reckoning for that. There's going to be an account that is going to be, God is going to call for someday. That being the case, and I know sometimes you read through this and it's almost as if Solomon is kind of saying things randomly, but he's not. His mindset behind this does God prejudge people for things they will do one day? Does he judge me what I'm going to do 5 minutes from now? In 5 minutes from now, if I were to sin, okay, would that be then I have sinned, I've done something wrong? That's why Solomon says God requires an account of what is past, not what is to come. He's going to judge each person based on what he has done. Not what will do or might do, what he has done. And it is to that statement regarding the mortality of man, the linear nature of time to which we are slaves. We can't change the passage of time. We can't go backwards, we can't go forwards. We're stuck right here in the present. And once now is over, it was a minute ago. That is the nature of man. We can't change that. God is going to bring everything to an account. And it is to that also, this plan, this providence of God, that Solomon speaks here in verse 14. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away from it. God does it that men should fear before him. The mortality of man, but also into verse 15, what else? The judgment of man. This is what man must consider. This is what man must have in his mind, given his nature, to have the proper perspective, the proper priorities in this life, to remember that we're all going to die. Death comes to the young, death comes to the old. It doesn't make any difference. Life happens, and we have to be prepared to give an account. And that is part of the providence of God. That's part of the plan of God and how he has created us, and for that matter, nature to function. Anything through verse 15? Yes, ma'am.
This is one of those faith-affirming things for me, in that Solomon writes this, that's the nature of man then, it's the nature of man today.
Yeah.
And the word that God has given us in the New Testament to live by, that we're going to be judged by, was it applicable to living for your good at that time? And for times past, for times present, and for times to come. You know, you don't need a new gospel. You don't need a new anything, because people don't change. So the rules we need to live by don't change.
Right. You know, it's interesting. It just occurred to me as you were saying that a way in which we can define the type of wisdom that Solomon is sharing with us, could define it as wisdom of faith. Because it's not really wisdom of law, because the law changed, didn't it? Law changed from Abraham to Moses. It changed again from Moses to Christ. But the character of faith, the people of faith, have they always been the same, regardless of what law that they lived under? Yeah, that's part of the point that the Hebrew writer makes in Hebrews chapter 11, is that the people of faith have always been the same. Their character of faith has been the same. Because, partly, they understood their nature. They understood what perspective they were to have on this life. They understood the priorities they needed to have. So in a lot of ways, the type of wisdom Solomon is sharing, in some ways you could characterize it as wisdom of faith, in that it's timeless. It's not just based on the sacrifices of the old law. It's based on the character of faithful people who are seeking to serve God, regardless of whether they lived in Solomon's time or they live today. Anything else through verse 15? Verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. And I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. So Solomon now extends his observation of the nature of man, the fact that we are mortal, that is part of what God has designed, that there will be a judgment, that's part of verse 15, that's part of God's design. Man cannot avoid it, there's nothing that man can do to stop it. That's simply the way God has created things. But moreover, now notice the realm in which he speaks now in verse 16. How does he define that realm? Under the sun. Okay, under the sun. So when we're talking about under the sun, we're talking about the mortal life and his observations in this mortal life. He says, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. What does he mean by that, in the place of judgment?
What's happening in this world today?
Okay.
People getting off of crimes and getting off. And where it should be judgment, wickedness is there. I mean, like you say, this is true then and now and in the future.
Yeah.
This judgment of man.
Right. Right. That should be guided by law, and generally those laws should pertain properly and be applied properly. Remember we talked a couple weeks back about Moses' father-in-law. What was his name? Jethro, thank you. I knew it started with a J. I'm like, Jacob? No, not Jacob. Jethro. Remember the advice that Jethro gave to Moses regarding setting up these judges to help Moses with the burden of having to deal with this multitude of people. You remember the characteristics that Jethro said that Moses, these are the men you need to look for. And some of those characteristics involve the fact that they were not covetous, that they did not have a desire or greed or a desire for money, that they were trustworthy and honest. Because in order to count on the law in a society, you have to have people who are in positions of power to apply that law justly. And Solomon observed that too often people who were in positions of authority, people that in which the common man relied and had to trust in these individuals, too often those people in those positions were corruptible. Whether they were they took bribes, or they were just looking out for themselves, or they were on power trips, whatever it was that caused them to be corrupted from the application of righteousness or proper judgment, Solomon says he saw wickedness instead. In the place of righteousness, and this is the upholding of, and again, under the sun. Granted, the law of Moses there was that spiritual aspect to it, but there was also the civil binding aspect to it. In the place of righteousness, again, in the judgment seats, where righteousness should prevail, where the definition that God had defined under the old law of right and wrong should prevail, instead of righteousness, iniquity was there. So we've got righteousness, judgment. Okay? Righteousness is God's standard. Judgment is the action on that standard. Then you've got iniquity and wickedness. Iniquity is the act of breaking the standard of God. Wickedness, as he says here in verse 16, is this corrupted nature that these individuals had. And for that matter, and just as Doug said, has this changed at all? I'm not saying that everybody in positions of authority are corrupted. But are we so naive as to think that every single judge that exists is perfectly pure and innocent in regard to judgment? No. It has been, it always shall be, under the sun. And this is part of what Solomon observes. But notice the contrast to God's judgment. Here, under the sun, can the judgment of man be perverted? Can God's judgment be perverted? No. See, there's so many layers that Solomon is interweaving here, and to that end, applications for you and I, to recognize that all things are beautiful in its time. God has made it that way. God has allowed man free will, which accounts for great goodness, great love, but it also can account for great wickedness, great corruptibility. God has created man to have that choice. And this is what Solomon observes. That which has been, that it will be. That which is, it's already been. It is this recognition that man's nature doesn't change. So, anything through verse 16 so far? He said, verse 17, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. This is right off of verse 16, that even if, and here's one application of this that certainly would be a part of what Solomon is describing, if you and I don't receive justice in this life, will justice still be had? That can't be changed. Yeah. There's a fellow down in San Antonio, I've mentioned before, Brother Jim. One of the things he always said, especially when somebody wronged him, was that it'll all come out in the wash and God will bring the soap. Now, I really like that statement, because not everything's going to come out in the wash now, is it? But one day, is there anything man can do that he can escape judgment? Whether it's justification or, for that matter, condemnation? It is not in man to direct his own steps. Jeremiah observed that within the context of judgment. And so when Solomon says this, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. What does he mean by that second part? Obviously, it's connected to that first part. What does it mean? There is a time there for every purpose and for every work. Time there to do what with every purpose and every work?
Make corrections if needed.
Okay, so there's a consideration of what God says, and I need to have the proper perspective, the proper priorities. I need to make corrections if I need to, okay? But then also, is there anything hidden from God? If I don't make those corrections, my purposes, the works that I've done, is there anything that God won't have time for in that judgment day? No.
He'll know every thought, every action, every word spoken.
Every word spoken.
He'll know everything.
That and that is something, and then we've talked about this before, that all the way from the Old Testament. Okay, a lot of times we think of the Judgment Day, the resurrection. We think of all of that as being a New Testament concept. But is that really the case? Or has God been declaring that since times of old? That there will be a day on which I will judge all man. God has made that known. He's made that clear. And so when Solomon describes this, a lot of times we apply this here on earth. There's a time there for every purpose and every work. And that's true. Solomon's dealt with that already in chapter 1. But I tend to think that this is as much an acknowledgement that God has set this aside, this plan, this design that God has created. There is a time there for every purpose and every work for God to bring to judgment. That seems to be what's primarily on Solomon's mind when he says this. There's not going to be anything left out. We're not going to run out of time. God will bring everything to account. And should this simply reinforce to us verse 14? What does the end of verse 14 say? God does it that men should what? Fear before him. Should I be aware of my mortality and live accordingly? Should I be aware that 5 minutes from now I could die? That demands I should be prepared to die, shouldn't it? Should I therefore fear, and we're not just talking about respect. Respect comes from fear. Fear in the New Testament, when it's referring to God, most often it uses the term phobos. That's where we get our English word phobia. Fear. Knowing what God has said is going to happen if you don't do what He's told you to do. Because I fear that judgment, because I fear knowing what He said He's going to do, if I don't obey, I therefore respect what He's told me to do. And I follow it. And that's part of this. God does it that men should fear before Him. Well, what is involved in that? There is a designated time. I'm not saying that it's set in stone as to a certain date, but there is a designated point, event, that God has scheduled. No man can change that. And when that time comes, there will be a time for, verse 17, there will be a time for every purpose and every work to be brought to judgment. Anything through verse 17. Verse 18, I said in my heart, concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. Another one of those, wow, Solomon, thanks a lot, that makes me feel really good, right? Solomon observes, does he say that man is an animal? Is that what he says? He says he's like an animal. He says, concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them for what purpose? What is it He wants them to understand and to see? In what way are we like animals? We're born and we die. We're mortal. We're mortal. That is what God wants us to observe and learn from nature. All things die. All things are born, all things die. What happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. So, that being the case, concerning the condition, we've been using the term or the phrase, the nature of man, God tests them so that we learn that lesson. How does God test us so that we can learn the lesson that we're mortal? How does God test us? And sometimes that term test may leave the wrong impression or may be confusing. In the end, what God does is to give us the opportunity to have the proper perspective, to gain the proper priorities based on our experiences in life. Right? When we talk about James chapter 1, when James describes the various trials, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the what? What does James say about patience? Knowing that the testing of our faith produces patience. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be complete, lacking nothing. The concept that James brings up, and for that matter, what Solomon describes here, from the recognition that when life happens, some of the most troubling, some of the hardest things for us to deal with happens to our loved ones. Okay? Those are some of the hardest things for us to deal with. Physical infirmities, things that happen tragically, and it reminds us that we are finite, that there is an expiration date for every single one of us, and there's nothing we can do to extend it. So when Solomon says that God tests man so that he'll understand his nature, so that he'll be reminded that there's no different between you and the animal. You're both going to die. He goes on to say there in verse 20, all go to one place, all are from the dust, and all return to dust. In this way, man is no different than animals. What Solomon isn't saying is that man is an animal. Never mind the whole idea from a spirit perspective. We'll deal with that in verse 21. But let's just look at it from the nature or the construct, the design of man compared to animals. What's one thing that we have, one example, in this life that is an advantage over an animal? What do we have the ability to do? Huh? To reason, to judge right and wrong. Okay? There are some gorillas and apes and so forth that have been taught how to do sign language, but there is no example of an animal, whether it's a gorilla or bird, that has ever gone beyond the mind of a child. And there's a reason for that. Because they don't have souls. Children, the reason why children are innocent and pure is because they're not yet able to judge right from wrong as it pertains to their soul. They know mom said this or dad said that, but at a certain point, or up to a certain point, that's all they understand. Man has the ability to reason. He has a conscience. He has the ability to consider the deeper nature. He can consider eternity. Eternity hasn't been put in the heart of gorillas. It's been put in the heart of man. So when Solomon says that this is how we're like the animals, he's not just saying we are like animals in every way except for the fact that we have a spirit. No, he says this is how we're like the animals. We all die. And that lesson in nature serves as a reminder to fear God. This is one of those testimonies that Paul referred to in Acts chapter 17 on Mars Hill when he was speaking to the Athenians, how that God has not left himself without witness. And he describes nature, the rain and the harvest. God bears witness of his power. So that's why verse 19, surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. From a purely physical perspective, am I any better? purely from a physical perspective. I may live longer than my dog, but in the end, whether that dog dies before I do or not, we're both going to die. Poor Rover's going to be dead all over, isn't he? But what one advantage do I have? Verse 20. Verse 21. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? He's not asking who knows if this happens. That's not what Solomon's observing. He's saying, who can see this? Who knows the spirit of the sons of men? Can you see the spirit of the Son of Man? Where's your spirit? Doug, can you point to me in your body somewhere where your spirit is? Where your soul is? Is it here? Is it heart? I don't know. I don't know where it is. But I know it exists. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men which goes upward? Are you able to discern the spirit from the flesh? No. But I know it's there. As opposed to the quote-unquote spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth. Which is to say, when an animal dies, is there anything that goes beyond that point? Elizabeth had that movie. What's that movie called? All Dogs Go to Heaven? All Animals Go to Heaven? Something like that? Some kind of Disney movie. I've never seen it. I don't remember. I don't know anything about it. But that concept that sometimes people wonder about, and they want to think they're so close to their animals. They have such a love for their animals. A lot of times and I've been asked by people who, generally don't know the Bible, will my animal go to heaven? No, it won't.
Just the dogs, not the cats.
Yeah, well, just the dogs, definitely not the cats. Oh, cat people. Oh, boy. Oh, there's a joke. I'm not going to go there, though. We observed from 1 Peter chapter 3 on Sunday that Peter says that 8 souls were saved, right? But what about all those countless animals in the ark? They were saved too. They didn't have souls. They were not separated between righteous and wicked because they are animals. They don't know any better. And that's the differentiation that Peter was making, was that these 8 souls, they were saved through water because a line was drawn between the righteous and the wicked by water. So in verse 22, Solomon says, "So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him?" Rather than being so absorbed in the future or so caught up in not living now, what Solomon says is, "I perceive that nothing's better than man should rejoice in his own works. Enjoy what God blesses you with. Be content in it, because you can't go forward into the future to see what's going to happen. So enjoy what God has given you richly within the will of God." All right, we'll stop there at verse 22. We'll finish up any thoughts here in chapter 3. We'll go to chapter 4 next week. Thank you, everybody.